we now know that it was founded in around about AD 55. That's early in the reign of Nero. And I was fortunate enough to be there at the very beginning. Now we'll just share screen. Yeah, so discovery of the legionary fortress at Exeter. It was a very exciting excavation. It's the one I was involved with started in the cathedral close at Exeter, and which was right in the middle of the Roman town. No clear signs of military occupation had been recognised in the town up until that time, and the excavation took place when a Victorian church, which was bang slap in front of the cathedral's west front, was demolished. And the trench we opened was absolutely intriguing. That's the foundations of the Victorian church there. And here we have a charcoal burial of the 9th to 11th centuries AD, and it was cut through a concrete floor, obviously Roman, that had been laid over a flight of steps. Monumental is a hackneyed term, but you'll see in a minute they were really had a ceremonial quality about them. And you can't see it here, but under the steps were the remains of a massive hypocaust. So we had sort of three phases of three periods of buildings here. So great excitement. And going back to yesterday's discussions, it's worth looking again, I think, at how we staff these excavations, or how they were staffed by the committee that ran them at the time. 1971, there was a huge shortage of archaeologists because there was a huge expansion in the funding for archaeology with the rise of rescue archaeology, especially in the historic towns. And we were a very motley crew. We were just basically all picture here of the ordinary diggers and assistant supervisors. That figure there is, in fact, Anne Gentry, later Anne Johnson, came from Art College, went on to write what's still standard work on Roman forts in the Northwest Provinces. I'm there, just finished a law degree at Exeter, went on into archaeology. Another figure there did archaeology and actually then went into the laws. So very mixed background, and I think in some ways it was a strength really that in 50 years ago that the origins of people going to archaeology at a fairly junior level, and in some cases rocketing up the ladder, not in my case, but in some cases rocketing up the ladder in a few years when they're still in their mid to late 20s. Was quite a strength. Anyway, to get on with the excitement then of the discoveries in the cathedral close, that burial had been cut through these steps, and you can see the scar where it was, and this turned out to be the steps at the end of the forum portico, and there's a colonnade base there, and the building, the original building, was the fortress baths. Truly monumental scale. This is a view across the Caldarium, with later basilica walls here running down. And this room was more than 22 meters long internally. So it was a huge building. But of course, legions were huge bodies of men. My name is Legion, for I am many, as the demon said in the New Testament. And excavations continued at quite a large scale through the 1980s, and I wrote up the Barves excavations for publication, and then started on a finds volume, and which was, in fact, I left Exeter in 1980, and the volume was completed. In fact, the bulk of the work, in fact, it was done by Neil Holbrook. And one thing that perhaps is less common nowadays is the fact that when I was given the task of writing up the excavations at Exeter on the Barves, it was assumed that I would also do the pottery, because in those days there weren't really many people around who you could subcontract projects like that out to. The coarse wares, of course, the Samian, mortaria, and so on were done by specialists. And getting back to the study group, I remember in 1972, the meeting that produced the CBA volume. I remember being summoned, not invited, but summoned to the university at Exeter by Aileen Fox. Lady Fox held sway over the archaeology in the Southwest for many years, who was hugely excited by the conference and sat down and gave us a very long précis of everything that had been discussed. And she was particularly interested in black burnished ware, which she published quite a lot on in the 40s. So anyway, by 1991, we had type series of the various fabrics at Commonwealth Fabrics at Exeter, and one of the type series was of the Fortress Ware, which is represented by four fabrics, and that's in addition to mortaria and flagons that were made locally. The types are derived, very wide derivation, some certainly from the Rhineland, some influence of southeast Britain, atrobetic bowls. But the most distinctive and common type, really, the origin of which I think is obscure, are these jars with flat rims and little lid seatings, most of them. The type 10 here in Fortress Ware A, which is a quite fine sandy fabric, and type 2 here, commoner fabric, and this is a very gritty grey ware fabric. In 1991, it seemed that these wares were primarily made to supply the Legion in the fortress, although it was clear even then that they reached forts elsewhere in the southwest, such as Nanstallen in Cornwall and Tiverton, which is about 15 miles north of Exeter. Now, we now know, some 30 years later, that the distribution of the fortress wares was much wider and had a different emphasis. And really, this is what I'm going to concentrate on now, a particular aspect of the fortress wares, which was their presence on Flavian sites in Scotland, and why that should have been the case. They were identified, these examples in Scotland, first identified by Vivien Swan, and they were discussed in a joint paper with me. I was very much a junior partner, and published in Brian Hartley's Festschrift in 1998. There we argued that they were likely to have been taken north by soldiers in their personal baggage. And the main purpose of this paper is to show that they're far more likely to have been the objects of trade. Yes, short-lived and not greatly significant in the wider scheme of things, but a trade which might also involve re-export from Exeter other types of pottery. And it has quite interesting implications. Now, there are two factors which are of some importance in this connection. And at this stage, I'll just mention what's really precipitated all this, which is the very, very large scheme financed by HRC, English Heritage, Exeter Council, etc., under the direction of Steve Ritten and Neil Holbrook, which has tackled the very large backlog of unpublished excavations, or more correctly, some unpublished, but a lot of them done in a archive form, which has now been made available online. There were the resources to do quite a lot of research and scientific work as well. And the main point about what has happened since the early 1990s is that the scale and the character of the military occupation at Exeter, our knowledge of it has been transformed. It was on a much larger scale and lasted in force quite a bit longer than was previously thought. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to whip through this quite quickly, but it's all in these newly published volumes, and there's another Devon Archaeological Society volume coming out of actual detailed site reports from recent excavations. The fortress is surrounded by a series of enclosures. There, for example, there's a palatial building there on the other side of the in fact, I'll go on to the next slide. Here, Mount Dinham, recently discovered tile kiln here. Palatial building, clearly the residence of a high official of the province. A fort coexisting with the main fortress there. Another fortification just recently found, bus station redevelopment here. And this area here seems to have been the Canabai, very extensive, the civilian settlement outside the fortress. This is the fortress plan as now known, reconstructed from a series of major excavations, but many careful observations in service trenches and odd interventions here and there. And the map here, all those sites around there, fortlets there and there, controlling the approaches to the fortress. And here at St. Loy's, a small town, which was exactly coeval with the fortress. When the fortress was abandoned, the town was abandoned. And then finally down here at Topsham, at the head of the ex-estuary, where there was the port, a very large complex of early Neronian, early Flavian finds, and recent excavation Cotswold archaeology strip buildings along the road right up here on the edge of this area of occupation. So all in all, a collection of military sites which for the Claudio-Neronian period in Britain and early Flavian period, I think is unparalleled. And obviously Exeter was very much a major military and administrative centre in those early decades of the occupation. And likewise, the number of forts in the southwest has multiplied. I can't go into the chronology, but they're broadly contemporary with the fortress, not of course all occupied at the same time. Some of those, most of those in Dorset, in fact, belong to an earlier phase, and they're still coming to light since this map was done. Another one here in North Devon. Now, coming back to the fortress ware, we now know that it was made, well, it's slightly more complicated than this actually, but originally work by David Williams suggested it was made in very close to the, basically around somewhere near the fortress at Exeter. But ICPS work by Gamal Badrashani at Durham and Roger Taylor, a geologist with an unrivaled knowledge of geology of the Southwest and a great interest in ceramic petrology, fixed the source of the clays anyway at the Bovey Formation, which is about 20 miles south of Exeter. That's near Torbay down here. That came as a bit of a shock actually to me anyway. Sorry. And I do wonder whether that was the source of the clay, but not actually where the pottery was made. The Exeter pottery, I'm told, has got a high iron content, and certainly the fortress wares aim for a nice pale grey finish to the two main fabrics. So question mark over that. But the distribution in the Southwest is very extensive. This map shows the red is the fortress ware, blue West Gaulish, possibly mortaria, which I'll come on to briefly in a minute. Distribution extends from Nanstallen here down in well into Cornwall to Dorchester and up to Bath. And it also occurs on civilian site. Well, Nanstallen's a fort. Bath, the stuff is from Walcott Street, where I'm sure there is a fort. But Dorchester, by the Iranian period, was presumably civilian, and it also occurs on indigenous sites in South Devon, such as Penn's Mount. By no means a distribution confined to purely military sites. And the other feature about it is that at Exeter, I must push on, curve time's tight. At Exeter, it's scarcest actually in the fortress, where South-Western BB1, this grey blocks here, is by far the commonest types. And this site here, Lower Coombe Street, is the Cannabye southeast of the fortress, and it shows much better there. And at the St. Loy's site, that's the small town that was contemporary of the fortress and then abandoned. It's dominant amongst the main coursewares. I haven't included the minor ones in these charts here. Moving on to other sites, information is a bit thin on the ground. Again, at Kelstock, which is on the Tamar, border of Devon and Cornwall, it's very well represented. South-Western BB1 is almost entirely absent. And the other major player there is Gabroic ware from Western Cornwall, a classic Iron Age, in fact, prehistoric origin pottery, which reached Exeter in tiny amounts. Oakhampton, also Gabbro ware, but much scarcer actually, and there obviously the fortress wares were being outstripped by South-Western BB1. and the final site, Tiverton, which is near the source of BB1, South-Western BB1. Of course, it's again very dominant. Now, moving up to the distribution in Scotland, it occurs on all 4 of the classic Flavian fort site and fortress sites in Scotland: Elginhof, Camelon, Strageef, Inch-Tootil, and also at York. I think the main reason for thinking that it's an object of trade rather than troop movements is the fact that the other ware in the southwest, which was much more popular than Fortress Wares, was BB1, particularly South-Western BB1, and it's certain that it didn't reach Scotland in that period. The organization of the fortress ware industry, which is very extensive and already supporting civilian markets, I think made it quite feasible for an attempt, perhaps not very successful, to market the ware to military sites in northern Britain. Sorry, I'll just nip back. It's possible, in fact, this vessel from Richborough here is also fortress ware. These tripod bowls are very common at Exeter. There's about a couple of dozen of these feet. Unfortunately, there's no complete profiles from Exeter, but even if it's not, the tripod bowls at Exeter must have looked very similar to that. And these are just the examples of the fortress ware from, these are from Elginhof. And very briefly, there's another type of pottery that occurs on the same site, certainly in the north, on the same sites, which are the Western Gaulish ? Or possibly Brittany mortaria. Now, if you look at this map at first sight, you would think that the distribution would seem to suggest that they actually originated in the southwest, and particularly at Exeter, where there are a couple of dozen examples of them. But certainly in 1991, when Kay Hartley wrote her survey of the Exeter mortaria, which I think is a classic and very important piece of work, that didn't seem likely because of the way that the military occupation in the southwest was then perceived. But now we know more about the fortress ware industry. It seems to me plausible, at least, that these originally thought, in fact, to be from Spain, these types of mortaria could possibly be Exeter products. There was a lively production of mortaria at Exeter in the late military period, and we have one of four potters that stamped their names on them. Along the rim, rather than across it, which of course is a feature of the these so-called West Gaulish mortaria. And there is another different type of Exeter mortarium from Camelon. Finally, just to wind up quickly, I'll just briefly mention another episode of export of pottery from the southwest. In fact, some 20 kilometers east of Exeter, which is South-Western BB1, in the mid-2nd century or thereabouts. Again, scientific work has tied it down to the Blackdown facies of the upper Greensand outcrop in East Devon. That's in this sort of area here. And Exeter's about 20 kilometres that way along the road here, and this is the Frostway coming in. And this type BB1 occurs quite widely in the military sites in the north, as we knew in 1991, but I've added a number of fresh sites to this original map here. Most important thing being that it doesn't really have a particularly Western bias. And here we have sites like Camelon and Cramond at the eastern end of the Antonine Wall. It occurs at South Shields, and in fact I haven't marked them on here, but there are 4 turrets along this part of Hadrian's Wall where the Ware is also known. And this can hardly be stuff transported by people. I think it must have been brought in by soldiers, because of course the Southwest had no military occupation in that period at all. So I think it's a product of trade. So finally, just to sort of, and quite characteristic forms, some are quite easily recognizable. Very rare, occasionally appearing in Southeast Dorset BB1, but not that often. And finally, characteristics of Fortress Ware. Of course, one tend to compare it with Usk. It's really, in the Flavian period, it was a major industry in southwest Britain, and serving not just military markets, but also civilian and indigenous markets. And there we have the rationale, I think, of the basis on which the attempt was made to market it. And I think perhaps an important factor is capacity. BB1 was expanding its markets in the southwest in the Flavian period. And Fortress Ware industry, being very, very successful in the main military period, had the capital and contacts necessary for long-distance trade. Now, I've run out of time, but I was going to say a little bit about the wider picture. This, and I'll just briefly say that this, I think, was a revelation, really, because I had assumed that Fortress Ware equaled made by the Legion, and that doesn't seem to be the case. Whereas, taking the Usk wares, for example, the wares there seem to have been confined, as far as I've been able to find out anyway, pretty much to the fortress. Certainly weren't traded widely over hundreds of kilometres during the fortress period there. And this ties back into what seems to be quite a large controversy now, which is the extent to which the state, viz. In the northwest provinces, that means the army, was involved in the production and distribution of pottery. A Franco-German opinion, I think, is that certainly with Samian, the state had very little involvement. And of course, pottery in Britain, I think those of us who I suppose condemned as Roman military archaeologists believe the same is true with the course wares, that they were largely civilian initiatives. But the opinion in southern England seems to be that the state was heavily involved through the procurator in the distribution of things like BB1. So I hope that's okay. It's slightly unnerving. I sometimes giving this talk, whether anybody's there, but anyway, I'm happy to take any questions.